Welcome to Creation Station Monthly. My name's Bob from Creation Station. This is our monthly program where we bring two different creators out there from somewhere in the world and bring them together. This is their first chance meeting each other to talk about whatever creative topic we've chosen for the month. This month, we've chosen performing to talk about and see what everybody's been doing with this. So let me introduce you to, I've got Yadira Peralta. How are you doing today?
I'm really well. I'm doing really well. How about you?
Life is great around here. And we've got Vinny Francois. How are you doing up there, sir?
I'm great. Thanks for inviting me, Bob.
Thank you, thank you. So I want to get started. My concept for this month was just to grab some different people. And Yadira is a poet and publisher and author down here in Miami. And Vinny is an improv college operator. And so let's get started with you, Vinny. Tell us about how you did that, what got you started on this, and you just fill in your questions and answers as we go along.
Yeah. Basically, I'm an improv comedian, improviser. If you've seen the TV show Whose Line Is It Anyway, you've seen some form of improv comedy. But that is more shorter form comedy. I am more in the improvised theater field, which is more improvising a play from scratch, from inspiration. And I was one of the founders and directors of the Montreal Improv Theater, where we taught and put on shows. So we're part school, part performance venue, and here in Montreal, Canada. And that was my job for the last, I guess we started 2002. And once the COVID-19 hit, we had to shut down, and I pivoted everything out into an online world, and I started Improv College, which is an online only improv school. So that's what I've been up to.
Thanks, Vinny, for sharing. So on my end, I'm a poet. I have been writing poetry in some form or another since the age of 6, and finally decided to take it seriously in my 20s when I was in college, and I eventually went on to the MFA program at FIU to get my master's degree in poetry. So
Florida International University, for those not
yes,
from South Florida.
yes, and so my day job is as an editor, and so I'm a book editor with Mango Publishing, which is based in Coral Gables, but it's been considered by Publishers Weekly the fastest growing publisher in America for the last 3 years. And so while it seems like it's two completely different things, the two have been kind of overlapping more and more lately. And I'm sure I'll get the chance to talk about that a little bit more at some point.
And has the pandemic shifted how you operate?
Well, we started working from home pretty early, a lot earlier than most people I know. My So our team is very international. We do have a lot of our team members are based in Miami, but some are in San Francisco or New York or London. We have team members in Ecuador and Singapore, and so my boss is very like tuned into what's going on around the world, and so he kind of had been paying attention to the virus for a while, and as soon as there was an inkling of something happening in the first week of March, he just sent everyone home. We were already wired to work remotely. We've been working with Zoom for the last 3 years at least. So the big change was that I wasn't going into the office. I was working from home. That on the one hand, that gave me more time to work on my personal creative projects, but working from home was a different kind of stress. I just like, and we talk about that at Mango a lot actually, that I missed working with my other team members in the office, and that we didn't have each other to kind of like brainstorm ideas on the way to the kitchen to get coffee, that kind of thing. So we found that our creativity began to go down a little bit. But the good thing is that we became aware of it and just tried to find new ways to kind of to be creative and come up with new ideas for books and marketing and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds very similar to, I mean, we have like a magnified version of that in
Mhm.
improv because it's a collaborative creative form. And so not being in the same physical space together means all of the performance that we're doing is through Zoom. And it's become termed Zoom Prov because forcibly we're on camera, and we don't have that physical connection. I can't look directly into someone's eyes. It's like mediated through this technology. So there is a bit of a like a layer that's been introduced in between, like rather than direct contact with like the person that we're performing with. And so that co-creativity, that collaboration, it feels different, certainly. And improv being inherently a collaborative form, not being able to be in contact with people, it feels like a huge challenge. And I was very skeptical about how it would continue um, through the pandemic and over technology. But the more I started doing it, the more I recognized that it wasn't the same physically, but it still had a lot of facility with to enable us to connect with one another. And there are advantages that physical improv doesn't have, and a lot of that came out just from trying out different things. Some of the advantages were immediate in that I could play with people from around the world. If I could Zoom with someone who I was living in the same town with, is zero difference between having a Zoom in a performance with someone literally in around the world, in Australia or in Europe or across the States, Canada, wherever they may be. And so it allowed a lot of kind of global connection. One of the nice things that has emerged is like a global improv community. And so we've in this improv community, we've had to like you say, adapt to finding new ways of collaborating and co-creating.
Yeah, I'm
That's
actually.
interesting. Tell us, Yadira, I want to hear about that from your side too on that, because everybody hears about Zoom fatigue, and I can really see where, from Vinny's point of view here, of when you're especially concentrating and looking into somebody's eyes, and you are really doing the hard focus thing that seems to be tiring everybody out. For you guys, since you were already online before this, how did you guys feel in adapting to that, like Vinny was adapting?
Well, while we were used to using Zoom, it felt like since our company was growing at the same time, luckily, despite the pandemic, our company began to grow more and more, and so more meetings, more required meetings sort of started popping up. And so I was honest with some people in smaller teams that I worked with, and just let them know, like, I'm really tired today, so I might take a break. So I'm going to be off Slack, which is an app that we use to communicate with each other, or just being off camera at some of those meetings if I wasn't necessarily meeting with an author for the first time and needed to be on camera. So I think and a good thing about our team is that we are always sharing like we call self-care tips, just reminding each other, hey, like, have you taken your lunch break, or have you stepped outside to see the sun? you know things like that have been very helpful, actually. And I will say, I did want to mention one thing that came to mind when Vinny was mentioning his improv. And so I'm glad that he mentioned accessibility, because that definitely is one thing that I was able to experience in the last year, at least as a poet who had to do readings or attend readings or moderate panels, that I found, for example, at you know, events like the Palm Beach Poetry Festival or events like the O Miami Festival, that I noticed that there was an uptick in attendance. And when people were kind of popping up at the events and just sharing with each other on the chat where they were from, that there were people from Europe, and there were people from Asia and Australia that were joining. And I just thought, how would they have gotten the chance to attend an event at the O Miami Poetry Festival if it hadn't been online? So I'm just hoping that as we kind of start to emerge out of quarantine and things start going back to, quote unquote normal, that we still maintain some of this online accessibility that we've been able to achieve.
We talk about it here is we're not going back to normal, we're going to better.
Yeah.
And accessibility, we use accessibility in the other term also here. For example, I mean, we have a transcript that we do after each one of these episodes so that people can read them and do those sorts of things. So tell me about when you were growing up. You mentioned 6 years old and you're writing poetry.
Yeah.
That's a great thing. Let's hear about this.
So, I was born in Honduras and my family moved to the States when I was 6 years old. And while I began to pick up the language quickly, I think my parents tell me that it took me about 6 months to pick up the language. My reading, like I still remember not speaking English, and that was a very weird experience to be constantly surrounded by a language you don't understand. And I had already in Honduras and the Spanish language had begun to fall in love with books. So to then come to the US to not be at reading proficiency and to not understand what other people were saying, that was like a very alienating experience. And luckily for me, we had Spanish classes, the kind where you were pulled out of your regular class to do, Spanish for, if that was your first language, or Spanish for the students that mostly spoke English. And one of my teachers there was teaching us how to do a haiku in Spanish at one point. And she seemed to like the way that I wrote. So, for weeks after, if I finished my activities early, she would take me aside and say, why don't you just, write some more haiku? And so, she started accumulating them. And I had no idea what she was doing. But a few months later, she said, I picked out what I think is the best haiku out of all the haiku that you've written, and I'm going to enter it into what at that time was the Dade County Youth Fair. And she entered my poem into the Dade County Youth Fair. And I didn't win first prize, I won second prize, but it still was just affirming. Yeah, it was super cool. It was super cool. And I've just been in love with writing in some form or another ever since then.
How about you, Vinny? Did you were doing improv? I mean, I guess every kid does improv because we don't know any better. But how did you figure it out that this was going to be something to be able to move on to?
Oh, it wasn't. It was never something I planned to get into at any stage of my development. I ended up going to university here in Montreal at McGill, studying the sciences, and the university had an improv club, and some of my friends were there, and they invited me to come join. I thought it'd be a fun hobby, and so I would go and hang out with them and goof around. And I thought it was just a nice way of letting off steam, be playful, have a good laugh with my friends, and just hanging out that way. But I really enjoyed it, and the more I started doing it, the more I started getting into it. And then eventually we formed a troupe and started playing at comedy clubs around town, just in a very amateur way. And at a certain point, so a couple of us started maybe we could teach classes. So we started offering classes, and then just on a very casual basis.
And what was your source of money during this time?
Well, I was working. I graduated
as a what?
Oh, as a satellite engineer.
Okay.
So I was working on satellite communication.
See, we like to see these things. People can be creative in lots of different talents, lots of different things feed into your life. That's a good thing.
And so by day I was a satellite technician engineer, and by night I was pretending I was a chicken talking to the farmer, as people do. So yeah, as I started teaching classes, I thought, oh, what if I just shifted gears? Because shockingly, pretending to play games all day is a lot more fun than, dealing with satellite communications or other computer foibles. And so I just slowly pivoted over to becoming an improv teacher, and then eventually founding a theater here in Montreal, and running it. And yeah, it just took over my life more and more as time went on.
So who do you think there you've got Darius gave us a partial answer. I'm going to come back to you on your
Mm.
on other mentors because I know someone else happened after that. But for you, Vinny, who you said you were hanging out with some people. Do you think they were do you think of them now as mentors that and how did it work for you, or how would you reimagine that as a mentorship for somebody else to get in?
Yeah, you know what? I would probably term it more peer development rather than mentorship,
Okay.
because we were all learning at the same time, and it was real trial and error. Um, one of the main motivations for starting an improv school in the first place was that frustration of not having one in the city and not having access to that kind of development and teaching and guidance, and feeling like, oh, I guess if it's going to exist, we have to make it. So we just put it in place and hoped that people would come, and then they did. And I've said this in several places where I think the people who took like 2 years of classes were far better improvisers than we were after, like, 8 years of probing in the dark, trying to struggle our way forward. I think mentorship is super important. Having that guidance, having that input and feedback, and support is so key to anybody's development. It's become a main part of my practice to this day.
Tell us, Adira, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so it's funny because I meant to include sort of the transition between my writing as a kid and my writing as a taking it on as a sort of a serious endeavor, I guess. And I did go away to college. I went to Queens College in New York, but 3 years in, I missed Miami and decided to move back to Miami, and I decided to finish my degree at Florida International University. And just by chance, Campbell McGrath was beginning his teaching career at Florida International University. I decided to take a poetry class with him. And while I loved poetry and read poetry, I never really thought that it was something I could really include in part of my life as a full-time thing. I didn't really see myself as a poet, but just seeing, first of all, that the kinds of things that he would write about, that he could write about the vernacular, I guess, that he could write about, one of his famous poems is about a 7-Eleven, that he could write about everyday life, and that he could do it so intelligently and so enthusiastically. I just really, I really completely fell in with poetry at that point. I knew that was something that was going to be part of my life, forever. And so that was really important to me, and it continues to be important to me even as I, as I grow older and grow into what I do. I am constantly looking for not just people to mentor, but for mentors. I hope that I never stop learning.
Mhm. Yeah, it's so key. I think the moment, yeah, anytime you feel like you're done as an artist, like you're like, oh, I've finished growing, then like what? That seems like an impossible thing to establish. Like you always want to be developing, you always want to be growing and challenging yourself, and pushing the envelope of what you're capable of. And it is also very gratifying to help other people find that voice in themselves, to find that limits of what they're capable of, and assist them along the way. I think it's such a key part of any artistic practice to be nurtured and to nurture.
Again, slightly off top, breaking this topic into a different out of left field for you two guys. One of the
Mhm.
questions I always ask people is what kind of equipment did you start using, and how did that change over time? And what's your, what's the ideal? What's your most favorite thing? And we get all sorts of interesting questions from engineers and photographers, but I want to know, what does a poet think about when you think equipment? When you think, I mean, is that a beach setting for you that you need this ideal setting to be creative in, or is it what? What do you think about when
Um,
when ask you for equipment that you use?
it's funny when so that time period at the end of college when I decided to take poetry more seriously, I was also doing photography, and one of the reasons why I took a huge break from photography at that time was because of how expensive. I loved it so much, but it was a very expensive hobby. And one of the coolest things that Campbell said was that the really cool thing about being a poet is that you can be an amateur historian, sociologist. You can take what you learn from painting. You can take what you learn from pop culture and music, and you can incorporate all of that into poetry. But you don't really need anything except a writing tool. Um, you know, some people prefer computers, but I still use notebooks. Um, that I have tons of notebooks that I collect, and the fanciest that I get is obviously once I begin to redraft some of my work, I do it on computer. And I actually do love my iPhone because it's made photography cheap. I take pictures of things that I maybe later want to write about. I often record myself, thinking out loud about ideas that I want to work through before I commit them to paper. So that's about as fancy as I get. But I'd like to think that if I ended up in a desert island, as long as I could find something to write with, I could live.
Nice.
Yadira, do you still have, like, what is the earliest notebook that you still have?
Um, I actually found this is really funny. I found a diary that I kept when I was in middle school. And it was just one of those cheesy, like if you went to a greeting card store and found, one of those little diaries with a lock on it. And I still remember the one I bought was really cheap. It wasn't like a hardcover, it was like almost made of plastic. And my sister decided to break into it by cutting through the cover, and I still have
Wow.
it makes me laugh now, but that's like the earliest notebook that I have. Yeah. And I'm curious, what tools do you like to use?
I guess it depends on the task at hand. If I am performing, I guess I just need someone else. Although that you can do solo improv, my preference is to do with other people and bounce off of, as I said, it's collaborative, so you're always bouncing ideas off of one another, and so you're developing a story or on a moment built off of someone else's ideas, and they're building off of yours. And there's an expression in the improv world that no one has to bring the whole castle; you just have to bring a brick, and then
Mm.
together you build it. And so without having, it kind of takes the pressure of creation off. You just have to do things one step at a time. And so for me, the equipment, so to speak, is just someone to bounce an idea off, someone to riff with, someone to co-create with, and that feeds me. That really excites me. But when I'm teaching, it's a notebook. It's also a notebook because I'm constantly scribbling notes about what's happening in scenes and what notes I want to. It's like, oh, I have to remember at the end of this to mention this, and so I have notes and like around right here on my desk. I think I can see four notebooks at various stages of being full, and each one
Come
I'm
back and take
using.
my tech class on Rocket Books, which are digital
Yeah.
versions of paper books that you can turn into digital.
But I love paper books. I love pen and paper, and so I think, like Idira says, like there is
Yeah.
something about creating on a pen, but like there's that direct connection, that tactile. And I love technology. I'm a tech
Hmm.
person as well, and so it absolutely is a great tool for creating as well. But when it comes to that direct connection between my mind and putting some letters somewhere physical, that like a pen to paper always feels like the most direct link. There's like the fewest elements between me and the act of creation there.
That's nice. I like that. Adira, how do you feel about poetry being accepted out in the wider world right now? It feels like, especially, we've during the inauguration, we had an explosion of, and it seems to be really popular. It's at least in pop culture, it's come more to the forefront again. And how do you feel like that is reflecting in your world?
Um, you know, when I really began, I don't know if you want to call it my poetry career, but when I really began poetry, all of my teachers, professors talked about it as this sort of like niche, underground sort of art that, and even I thought about that. Like I think about how some of my favorite poets were huge famous people in poetry, but if I went to someone in Times Square and mentioned their name, you wouldn't really know who that person was. And I feel like that is that's slowly changing. It's changing even in publishing, where a lot of poets are being also asked to write in other genres. They're being asked to write novels, and they're being asked to write books of essays. I think it's exciting. I think that while some people's experience of poetry, especially in school, can be alienating because possibly the first poem that you were exposed to in high school or something was by William Shakespeare and you didn't really understand, or it was by someone written in the 17th century and you just couldn't get past the difficulty of the language. There's so much great work that's out there being written right now by poets who are living. It's kind of my hobby is to, if you're a friend or an acquaintance, I like to know you long enough to figure out what your favorite thing is. And if it's rap music or if it's football, I'll find the poet for you. And so I love to introduce people to poetry that way. So, I think it's my friend's husband is into the Wu-Tang Clan. And so I found a poet who has written several poems about that hip hop group. And I gave him the book and he fell
Nice.
in love with the poet. So, I just think poets are amazing. So, I'm hoping I'm hoping that this continues, actually, that we keep seeing poetry out in the larger world, because I think it's language that's immediate, but it's also it's deep. If it's the right work, it can tell you a lot about the human condition, I guess. Um, so it's an
I have
exciting time.
my question, I think, is like, 'cause hearing you talk about this, of like
Yeah.
hearing about like poetry being alive now, and I only know it very tangentially if come across maybe an issue of a New Yorker magazine which has some poetry in it. Like that's my only real connection, or where I would come across it in a published way. Um, like, are there like what are the poetry magazines or publications where it's like, yeah, this is the one of the places to find all the hot new poetry?
Oh,
Like,
that's
where do
a
they go for
really,
that?
yeah, that's a great question. There's a great website called poets.org. It's the Academy of American Poets. And actually, if you sign up to their newsletter, you get a poem a day. And so it's every single day, it's like a new poet. They all tend to be young poet. Yes. And there's Terrence Hayes. That's the poet who wrote about the Wu-Tang Clan. Um, so,
Amazing.
so yeah, so they send you a poem a day, and it's all living poets, different ages, different backgrounds. I think on the weekends they might do like a dead poet, so they might do Emily Dickinson or something like that. But the really great thing about it is that you get to see people writing in different languages, meaning different dictions, different types of English language, I guess, and experiences that are out there. And I used to, when I used to teach at the college level, I used to use poets.org, and a lot of my students would say I didn't know that poetry could be like this, that it could speak to me, or that it could speak my language. So yeah, that's what I recommend. And
Love it.
yes, Joy Harjo, our poet laureate.
She's going to be here at the library speaking later on this summer.
Oh, super awesome.
Virtual is part of. It's going to be great at part of the end of. Yeah.
Amazing. What a great resource. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you, Vinny.
It's funny. One of the things, so people often ask improvisers. I mean, one of the things, I'm going to circle back. I've got like a lot of thoughts here. I'm going to try to sort. So one, I'm going to circle back to what you said about poetry not being necessarily a recognized art form. I definitely feel that with improv, where if you went to Times Square and asked like, oh, can you name an improviser? People would even just ask like, what's an improviser? Never mind being able to name one. And so it's, yeah, I think that working in this field, there are like some big names and authors and people who have tons of experience in history and are wonderful performers and different teachers, and but outside of this field, like, yeah, they're not super well known. And so I super relate to what you're saying about that. And then the other part is, as an improviser, people often ask like, oh, what are some other skills that I can bring to my improv? Like, what other classes can I take that will feed my improv skill? And so, often it's acting. Sometimes clown classes can unlock people's physicality, but also language classes and poetry classes, because a lot of, certainly North American improv is very verbal. It's very like talky. I would say European stuff is a lot more emotional, less talky. It's like this. It's funny, like different regional ways of doing improv around. Each
That's
have their own kind
interesting.
of vernacular. Oh yeah, it's super interesting. But yeah, taking writing classes and poetry classes and music classes, all of these things contribute to any performer's kind of toolkit. And these are all skills that I think are great to be able to make into a holistic whole.
Yeah, I do what I call improv fiction, for my D&D, for my role playing games, where
Mhm.
it's where I need all that. I need that be able to bounce things off. I need that poetry fiction base to be able to do. I can see where you guys can really bounce all this together and tie it all in. Yeah, it works. That's interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah,
I
I'm
understand.
curious. So I love reading or listening to comedians talk about their process, and a lot of well-known comedians have started in improv,
Mhm.
in the U.S. and Canada actually. And so I'm just curious, Vinny, like, do you think that improv is something that the regular person who doesn't have that background could do it as like a side thing? Like what, like if I took an improv class, how would that strengthen my skills as a poet, or just as a person that has to speak in public on a regular basis?
Yeah. That's a great question, and it is a question we get, like, oh, what else can I do with improv, or how does that? Yeah, why are so many comedians come out of this tradition? I think a couple reasons this helps this skill. One is because it's relatively accessible. It doesn't have necessarily a lot of equipment or like intimidation. Hopefully, like I feel like acting or stand up, where you're just like get in front of a crowd and you're like, oh, everyone's either gonna laugh at me, or it feels way more terrifying to some people. Although improv is also terrifying to some people. Because improv, it's not just you, it's a collaborative, it's a team sport, versus like it's not golf, it's soccer. It does require a lot of teamwork, and I think it opens people up to their collaborative nature. It opens people up to being receptive to other people's input, which allows you to be more receptive to your own input, and allows you to kind of, I say, you collaborate with yourself when you take improv skills out into like the solo creative arts, like writing, poetry, music. And the second thing, and this is a class that I've actually created, which is, I have a class called Where Are My Good Ideas? And improv teaches us not to judge our ideas and kind of really embrace what is happening in this moment without over analyzing things, without getting this voice of self-criticism in the way. And so improv gives us a way of being creative without putting all of these creative roadblocks in our own path, and so that the blank page doesn't scare us as much. Where it's like, oh, I got to put something down and it has to be perfect. When improv teaches us not to be perfect. It teaches us to embrace imperfection, and that's such a key part of any creative process. I think it really allows us to put stuff down that maybe isn't perfect out the gate, but we can find something in it that inspires us, and like, oh, I like this part of it. Where does this garden path go? Where does this lead? And so I think improv
Something you
leads
said there,
that way.
Vinny, I want to follow up on, and Yadira kind of asked it in a different way too. Comedians and improv are just always, and I think in a lot of the popular opinion, linked together. Is there non-comedic improv out there?
The general understanding of improv is improvised comedy. But what I like to talk about is improvised theater. And so improv is not a genre of comedy. It is, for me, a way of doing theater. And so improv theater can do anything that all forms of theater can do. It can make us feel happy. It can make us laugh. It can make us feel sad. It can make us feel uh, aroused. It can make us feel terror. It can make us feel things. Anything that theater can do, improv can do, because it is a way of doing theater. And 99% of the time, it is used to do comedy. So it's a very natural mix to have like improvised comedy. But I love exploring non-comedic improv. I've got a show called It's Not You, It's Me, which is all about an improvised breakup. And so the show is entirely about the end of a relationship that is completely unscripted. The characters, the script, the nature of a dissolution is unscripted. We just know that there are going to be a couple that are formed, and the relationship ends throughout the course of the show. And just as there are a wild myriad of relationships, there are many ways a relationship can end. And so we improvise around that idea. And it's not meant to be funny at all. It's an improvised tragedy, I call it. So there are so many different ways of exploring dramatic improv.
And Yadira, how about comedic poetry? Because everybody thinks of poetry as being this beautiful, romantic, serious. But I know you've got to have some examples for us of something out there, right?
I yeah, okay, a few are coming to mind. I know that when I while I was in the MFA program, when I first began producing the work that I did there, and then reading it in public, I noticed that things that if I wrote about my family, for example, and the interactions with my family, that things that I knew were amusing but maybe didn't laugh at anymore because I had played these scenarios in my head so many times, and then I think, well, I'm just including this because it's quirky or it's saying something, but then I would read it out loud in public and I would see the reaction, and it didn't really matter how many times I read it or different audiences that people would laugh in the same spots. And so that's something that I think happened a lot with my early work. And one thing I noticed is that if I'm writing a lot and not performing as much, my work does become a bit more serious. So I do try to, especially as I begin to put a book together, it's really important to me to kind of have a variation of tones and feelings and themes within the book, so that you don't read something that is completely funny from beginning to end or completely sad from beginning to end. I think that's really important. And again, one of the things that attracted me to poetry was that you could write about the things that you are observing. So haiku is you're writing about things that you're observing in the moment. That you could write about your parents or your best friends or your neighbor down the street. And so what happens if you're writing about these kinds of experiences, you're sort of communicating a variety of different senses of the world, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, and James Tate is a poet I really like a lot. His work is really surreal, but it's just really weird and funny in moments. So definitely I do like funny poems. I feel like there need to be more in the world.
Cool. And so, question for both of you guys. Um, with Clubhouse and all the chat things that are happening in the world and all that, and it seems like it's becoming much more of a vocal type of ability between us all. How do you guys see that evolving for your two fields? Because I can easily see where you could do thing in Discord for a comedy club type of thing, or hosting a poetry thing on Spaces in Twitter or whatever. How do you guys feel about that evolution, and how do you think that that's going to affect where we're going forward?
Well, I'd like to say that I haven't used Clubhouse a whole ton. I have gone into the app a few times, and it is a relief to be in a space that doesn't really have images. So you're kind of like, you're not like, you are on stage. And it's funny when you're in a chat room or something at Clubhouse, if you are allowed to speak, it's called, being invited on stage. So you are in a sort of stage, but it's different. You don't, you don't have that same kind of thing that you're experiencing when we talk about Zoom fatigue, where you have to you're being looked at all the time. So it's really nice to have sort of that oral experience. And I think like Instagram has, to talk about another app, has been really a fantastic way to share not just poetry, but other kinds of creative work. I, as an editor, I'm now looking for illustrators to possibly bring on for children's books. And the first place that I'm going to is Instagram, because you can just right there take a look at a recent body of work. So yeah, those are really neat. I have been considering sharing poems on Instagram stories, but I have not done so yet.
Yeah,
What do
I
you think,
think yeah, there's so many different ways of using technology, and there's so much technology now too. Even within like Facebook, which has Facebook Live and Stories and Instagram, and Discord has so many different ways of entering. There's so much media accessibility. It's quite we have just a whole cornucopia of options, and so it feels like everything is getting dilute. Everything had concentrated into like a few silos of like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and then now it's like re-proliferating in different assets, and that's Clubhouse and Discord and so many other ways of sharing things. I think Zoom is probably going to stick around for improv. That seems to have been the technology of choice for improvisers, because it allows both the physical and the audio. There are people doing improv stuff in Clubhouse. There are people doing improv stuff in Discord. I'm not super plugged into either of those communities, so I don't know how big and the kind of work that they're doing there. But I do know that the online improv community has really embraced Zoom as its medium, and streaming to either Twitch or Facebook Live or YouTube. Those are the kind of the main three
and so
platforms
Twitch
I
is how
use.
you would be doing your ticketing kind of thing for getting paid?
Yeah, you know what? There's very little paying stuff when it comes to people
Yeah.
online video shows. There are some people are doing, and this is what we do, is pay what you can shows. There are paid online shows, and some of them have been quite successful. But that generally takes quite a bit of work above and beyond what the average improviser has been doing lately. And again, it's because it's hard to compete with free. There's so much available entertainment that as soon as you put any barrier in the way, you have to have a very compelling product to get people to they have to be invested in it in some way to get them to fork it over.
That's one of the things I was looking at for Twitter Spaces, because of the tip jar idea. where you can still be in without having to pay. But then here we've got a tip jar up there for you to pay in, because I do believe artists should get paid. Huh.
Radical idea. It's
And
a
speaking of,
challenge.
yeah,
It is really tricky because, and I think even more so in younger generations, is that the idea of paying for the art that we consume can be anathema to a great group of people, which makes it very difficult to support the arts.
where do you think on that, Idria? How do you think we should be encouraging people to be able to pay for along these lines? Because I can see poetry, I mean, you get paid per word from a publisher
Hmm.
or paid per piece, if it's going to be published. But if you're going to be performing, if you're going to stand up on a stage and read two pieces of poetry or something like that, for the ability to even find a way to get paid for that, to be booked at a festival, how does that all feel for you?
It's funny. I have done a lot of performances where I have not been paid or early on, and also a lot of publications where I wasn't paid. And one of the really so the thing that changed things for me is once I became once I started teaching, and then on the side, so I became an English, like a part-time English professor, and on the side started teaching some one-day creative writing workshops, for example. And without my asking, they offered to pay. That was the first time that I had been paid for anything that that was tied to my poetry. And so once that happened, and then I began to work at a literary nonprofit and began to see what some of the the big poets were getting paid. And then I thought, I have to get a bit more confident about asking payment for my work. And one of the really cool things the new poets or writers or just young people in general is that they're aware of these things, and that they're feeling maybe a bit more confident than we did in the beginning about asking to be paid. And so when I've worked for literary groups, I've really I've asked them to pay the poets, to pay the like quote unquote volunteers, to make sure that everybody's compensated in some way. Especially if you are getting enough attention, if you do have enough of a platform. Obviously, if you're starting a young poets group in the beginning, everyone's volunteering and everyone's just trying to get experience. But at some point, if you do have a platform, then you should figure out a way to budget in paying the artist.
Yeah, yeah. We pay
Absolutely.
for our festivals when we host at and if the
Mhm.
library can pay people, everybody pay for things. Yeah, Vinny, you were saying that the barrier of entry, and to me, I guess I am of a different generation, obviously, where I just think like, well, I'm walking in their door in the theater, I'm going to pay the cover charge to get in and have the couple
Mhm.
drinks. This is half the price I would have paid to go see these guys perform on stage. So
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge in a lot of, and especially, I mean, live venues now have been just decimated by
yeah,
obviously in the last year, and so many improv theaters have had to close their doors across the world, around the world. It is quite sad to see, and yeah, I hope a lot of it rebounds and comes back once that does happen. That certainly is happening around many places. Um, but yeah,
do you
I
have a
think
season there? Do you have a season for that?
it depends. It was seasonal. So Montreal is a big summer city, but getting people to go inside in the summer is like a near impossibility unless you have a very big deal. And there are a couple of arts festivals in the summer. I mean, we have our big jazz fest, and Just for Laughs is headquarters here. We have our big festival for comedy, and those are always big. But getting people to take classes and come see improv shows is always a bit of a challenge in the summer because people just want to be outside. But then once the school year started in September, people would like kind of come back, and then in January, people would make their New Year's resolutions to kind of get out a little bit more. So there was a little bit of a seasonality to it, which was always interesting to follow.
Either how about seasonality kind of Winding towards that, the original question that I didn't actually vocalize was, how do you make a career of this, and how do you pull this off? And you guys have both answered that very well about how you can cobble together some pieces and make it work, and maybe not work, and whatever. But along this idea of getting paid and seasonal work, for example, I mean, like, I'm thinking performers. Whenever I think performers down here, they perform through the winter, when all the tourists are here, and then in the summer they have off because nobody wants to go outside in the 90-degree humidity and sit out at a concert. But Yadira, I'm not even aware of how does that work for poetry and for writing in general? Is there a seasonal thing to it besides a gift season of giving away books?
I think that would depend on a lot of it on your whatever your writing community is, locally or regionally. So there is a universal, at least in the United States, April is National Poetry Month. So, I live in a city that has a month-long poetry festival. And I have been lucky enough to be supported by that festival in the sense that in different years they've asked me to teach workshops, or they've asked me to do readings, or they've asked me to do really cool, innovative things like this last April. It was called I think it was called Ode to Remembrance or something like that, or Remembrance Odes. And people basically requested, custom poems to remember people that had passed away in the last year. Since a lot of people couldn't go to funerals, and so I wrote some poems for individuals who had lost loved ones. So through the Miami Poetry Festival, for example, other people have been able to see my work. And through them, I've had other people who've then asked me to teach workshops, or
Nice.
so that's kind of gotten gotten my work out to the public. But then there's the Palm Beach Poetry Festival is down here is in January. So then I've been asked to do, since I've worked with them, I've been asked to do workshops in January. So that really depends, and there's so many spaces like that across the United States. If I weren't an editor, I would probably be looking for places year round to kind of to teach different writing workshops.
Is there a poetry festival circuit?
Actually, yes. I didn't realize that until
Nice.
So when I was at the MFA program at Florida International University, I started interning in the winters for the Palm Beach Poetry Festival. And then I realized that a lot of the people that would go there for the classes, for the workshops, many of them were flying in from out of town. And they also were going to the different, writing workshops like Bread Loaf and Tin House. So there are some people that do kind of travel around, at least in terms of attending workshops, and a lot of teachers also that teach at the different workshops.
I'm thinking like a little Renaissance festival that travels the country, and everybody's a poet or an author reading off, and we'll add an improv comedy troupe over to the side here for you, and we'll all make this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you guys both very much for doing this. I'm gonna before I stop everything, I want to make sure I share your websites out there for everybody. Yadira's website here, justhername.com, and she's got all of her stuff here, publications, press, and some readings, and she is on Twitter, folks. This is one of the ways I was checking on things. I think you have enough followers to do a Spaces, Yadira.
Yeah, I think I do. I'm also on Instagram under the same username as my Twitter handle.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Great. And for Vinny, here is your Improv College. It's improvcollege.ca, because Vinny is up in Montreal,
Canada. That's right.
And lots of cool stuff here going on with this. And it has been really interesting to try and read through all of your stuff on here, trying to figure out and picking up some hints and tricks about what I can possibly do.
there's a lot going on. It's a whole community of stuff, and so you can kind of figure out what's happening and see our classes and follow our YouTube channel for shows. We got a whole smorgasbord.
It is. That has been great. Well, again, thank you both very much for being here this month to talk about all this. Let me throw up our final slide here. So everybody, Creation Station at Broward.org is how you can email us if you need more information about our guests, if you have a topic you want us to talk about in an upcoming month or recommend someone for me. Thank you again, Vinny Francois, Yadira Peralta, for having a great conversation here all about performing. We'll see everybody next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.